Hello, everyone. My name is Jennifer Gibson. I'm Director Curator of Gallery 1CO3, which is the campus art gallery of the University of Winnipeg. It's my pleasure to welcome you this morning to a talk by Amy Mazowita entitled Life of Fire, an Ethnography of Smoke, Flame, Ash, and Earth, which considers fire-affected landscapes of Manitoba's Whiteshell Provincial Park, Treaty 3. Today's talk is programmed as part of Forecast, an exhibition by Christina Battle, which is on view at Gallery 1CO3 until April 12th. Forecast features video, banner, and sculptural works that consider the complex ways in which we both sense and anticipate the climate crisis. I would like to acknowledge that Gallery 1CO3 is on Treaty 1 territory, the heartland of the Red River Métis, and the ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Innu, Anishinaabe, Dakota Oyate, and Denisuline. Our water is sourced from Shoal Lake, 40 First Nation. I want to take a moment to acknowledge the devastation and grief we are witnessing close to home and around the world at this time. And I want to express solidarity with those who have experienced and are experiencing the violence of colonization, which among many other horrors includes massive damage to our global environment and the air that we all breathe. For today's event format, moderator Dr. Bruno Cornellier will introduce Amy Mazowita, and then Amy will speak for about 40 minutes. We will then be open to questions from the audience. I encourage you to submit your questions to the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. So first, a couple of housekeeping items. We have ASL interpretation and captioning. Thanks to Jennifer Horvath for doing the ASL interpretation today. This event will be recorded and made available on Gallery 1CO3's YouTube playlist in about 1 week's time, possibly a little sooner. So now I would like to introduce today's moderator, Dr. Bruno Cornellier. Bruno Cornellier is an associate professor in the Department of English and the graduate program chair of the MA in Cultural Studies at the University of Winnipeg. He is currently working on a book on class, race, whiteness, and la question coloniale in contemporary Quebec cinema and society. Bruno is currently teaching a cultural studies course at the University of Winnipeg, and we are thrilled that his students are joining us today. So with that, I am going to pass it over to Bruno to introduce today's special guest speaker, Amy Mazowita.
Hi, thank you very much, Jennifer, for this kind introduction. I'm very happy to introduce Amy, who someone I have known and appreciated for quite some time since her days as an English student doing her BA here with us, and as an alum from the MA in Cultural Studies here at the University of Winnipeg. Amy, her is now a SSHRC-funded PhD candidate in the Department of Communication Studies at Concordia in Montreal, Quebec, which coincidentally is also the very same good folks with which I did my PhD quite many moons ago. So here's another connection between Amy and I. Her doctoral research is focused on representation of mental illness in autobiographical comics and is situated at the intersections of social media studies, comic studies, and critical disability studies. Amy is also interested in the environmental humanities and is currently working on a project titled Life of Fire, an Ethnography of Smoke, Flame, Ash, and Earth. This research creation photo life writing series is part of the SSHRC-funded Mobilizing Disability Survival Skills for the Urgency of the Anthropocene project, which the principal investigator is Dr. Arceli Dokumachi. Amy is a 2023-24 Concordia University public speaker, a core member of Concordia's Access in the Making, or AIM Lab, the communication representative for Concordia's Communication Studies Doctoral Students Association, and work as a TA in the Department of Communication Studies. So here you are, Amy. We can't wait to hear you talk.
Thank you, Bruno. I'll just share my screen right off the bat here. Okay. Hi, everybody. I'd like to first start by thanking everyone for being here. Thank you so much to Jennifer and everyone at 1CO3 for inviting me to share my work today. And of course, huge thank you to Bruno for moderating the discussion and having me join your class. Like Bruno mentioned, this is a bit of a full circle moment for me, having taken the field of cultural studies course with Bruno during my undergrad and having worked with him during my MA. So I'm very excited to be here today, sharing this project with the class and with everyone else in attendance. Okay. I want to start off by acknowledging and explaining the larger project that Life of Fire is part of, which Bruno touched on a little bit. The work I'm doing here is part of a SSHRC-funded project titled Mobilizing Disability Survival Skills for the Urgencies of the Anthropocene, or MDSSA, as we call it. The principal investigator of this project is Dr. Arceli Dokimachi, who is also my PhD supervisor at Concordia. Under the umbrella of the MDSSA project are several research creation micro-projects, which variously focus on issues related to disability, access, climate, and environment. These micro-projects are tied to various geographic locations and focus on a variety of topics. Mine, for instance, is located within a portion of the Whiteshell Provincial Park. One of my colleagues is working on a project in Mexico. One is researching the Portlands in Toronto. Another is studying and creating sculptures of mutated plants. So these projects are all very unique in their focus, but are interconnected by overlying and at times overlapping issues of access and environment. And part of what makes the MDSSA project so fruitful for me as a researcher is the collaborative nature of it. We meet weekly to share updates on our individual work and read various publications and media together. And we do this as a means of furthering both our individual projects as well as the MDSSA project as a whole. We're still in the early stages, but eventually we will be looking at different ways of disseminating our work to both academic and non-academic audiences. Now moving on to my specific project under the MDSSA umbrella, Life of Fire, an ethnography of smoke, flame, ash, and earth. So just as a disclaimer, this is a working title and the project is very much a work in progress at this point. There's still a lot of field work and research to be done before I would consider this quote unquote finished. But that said, I think talking about the process and development of a project is sometimes just as interesting as showcasing it in its final form, especially in a classroom setting such as this. So while I don't have a finalized set of images or a neatly packaged narrative to share today, I am going to be focusing on my research creation process, the origins of this project, some of the tensions and challenges I've run into along the way, and where I see things headed next. So to begin, I had the initial idea for this project in the summer of 2021. If you recall, it had been a very hot, dry summer in Manitoba, and there was an unusually high amount of wildfire activity across the province. This was extremely evident in the area I'm studying, which is the portion of the Whiteshell Provincial Park taken up by and surrounding Falcon and Westtalk lakes. If you're not familiar with the area, Falcon and Westtalk are around 1.5 hours east of Winnipeg and are located on Treaty 3 territory. They're also very close to Shoal Lake 40 First Nation, which is, of course, where Winnipeg sources its drinking water from, despite the community itself being on a boil water advisory only a couple of years ago. I mentioned this to not only contextualize the location in relation to the city of Winnipeg, but to also highlight the ways in which colonization has impacted the area. This isn't always at the forefront of people's minds when visiting the Whiteshell, but many, if not most of these towns and outdoor recreation spaces are grounded in and still very much under the influences of colonial enterprises. And I'll come back to this a bit later, but I wanted to mention it at this stage as it is crucial to understanding the area I'm working in, as well as the events and issues I'm looking at within that specific area. I also want to take a moment to note that I don't come to this project as an outsider. My family has been visiting Falcon Lake for generations, and my parents have owned property on the North Shore of Falcon since the mid-'80s. So it's a very special place to me and my loved ones, and I've essentially split my time between Winnipeg and Falcon Lake since I was an infant. So it is a home to me, and it's a place that I have a very personal and lasting connection to. And I want to mention that off the bat because my relationship to this place is one of the driving forces behind why I'm doing this work. So I really can't separate myself from it, as there are definite biases and implications for me to consider, not only as a researcher, but also as an active community member. So going back to the summer of 2021, as I mentioned, it had been a very hot and dry season, and this, along with other factors, contributed to an increase in wildfire activity. Some of these factors are, of course, naturally occurring, but many fires were started as a result of increased visitor presence and subsequent increases of human negligence. This summer was during the height of COVID, when people were responding to pandemic lockdowns by using outdoor activity as one of their primary sources of recreation. So this combination of extreme weather, the dry conditions, and the increased visitor traffic sort of created a perfect storm, and in turn, a perfect opportunity for fires to thrive in the area. In May of that year, there was a pretty significant fire near my parents' place in Falcon. I was there with my mom and our dogs at the time, and across the bay from where we were located, we began to see a lot of heavy, dark smoke rising up beyond the tree line. And from where we were standing, it appeared that the fire was much closer than it actually was to us. So we left the property as a precaution and joined others at a nearby beach to watch the progression of the smoke, as well as the attempts to douse the fire with water from the lake. So at this time, I'd like to draw your attention to the image on the screen. This photo was taken on the beach that day. So I was standing on the beach looking towards the tree line. They aren't very clearly visible in this photo, but there are several cabins tucked into the trees and a road that runs behind them. The water would have been to the right of me. If you look to the sky, you can see that the plumes of gray smoke are billowing up towards the white clouds and almost appear to be mixing in with them. And then we have the yellow water bomber airplane that is heading into the heart of the smoke. So this plane had just collected water from the lake to my right, circled around, and dumped it on the fire in an effort to extinguish it. There were a few planes working in tandem that day, and they would do this repeatedly until the fire was contained. I also want to show these photos, which were taken by other community members during that same fire. So the photo on the left was taken by someone who had gone to assist the volunteer firefighters, and the photo on the right was taken by someone from the opposite side of the lake from where the fire was located, showing again that heavy smoke as well as the orange flames burning just at the top of the tree line. And so the photo on the previous slide, as well as these, represent a bit of a pivotal moment in the way I had been viewing and approaching the impact wildfires have on individuals, landscapes, and communities. Now, I don't mean to compare this event to the insurmountable loss many people have experienced due to uncontrolled fire activity, because it was contained rather quickly and no one lost their home or their life. But because it was so close to home for me, my family, and our neighbors, it was a moment that really reiterated how quickly a fire like this can get out of hand and how much destruction and loss it can potentially cause. And so while I didn't realize it at the time, this precise moment was really the jumping off point for the project I'm now working on. So while the fire I showed on the previous slide wasn't able to spread very far, there was a regular presence of fire activities or active fires and the related affects of them throughout the summer. And something that continues to be very interesting to me is not necessarily the active fires per se, but how they can very quickly destroy an area, and how this increased fire activity affects the landscape, both in the actual fire zones and in the surrounding areas. And by this, I mean the ways in which fire, as well as the smoke and ash associated with it, degrades the surrounding air quality, as well as how it impacts the landscapes in the surrounding areas. So as the summer months progressed, the larger effects of persistent fires were consistently present. That hot, dry weather continued, And even when there weren't active fires extremely close to the community, there were still tangible signs as to how active fires in the area were impacting the environment. As I mentioned, the air quality was severely affected at various points throughout the summer. On several occasions, we would wake up in the morning to the smell of intense smoke, and it became very difficult to spend any time outdoors. These two images were taken from the same spot overlooking our family cabin. The left is a photograph taken on a clear day where you can see the lake and the opposite shoreline in the distance. And then we have the photo on the right that essentially looks like all that background scenery has just been erased. Turning now to how the land outside of these active fire zones was affected, this broader environmental impact became even more clear around mid-August when the weather changed from very hot and dry to more cool and rainy quite quickly. After a few weeks of this gloomier weather, myself and other community members began to notice new vegetation, specifically these large orange mushrooms that we had never seen before popping up everywhere. And this particular photo does not do justice to how widespread and abundant these mushrooms were. I was kind of late to photographing them in their prime, but they really seemed to be everywhere. We would walk down the gravel road connecting our cabin to the main road of the subdivision, and anywhere along that road where there was a particularly wet spot in the woods, there were these large groupings of these mushrooms sprouting up. And it truly looked like another almost like fairy tale-like world. Now, I don't know exactly how factual this is, namely because I haven't looked into the science behind it, as this project really is grounded in the humanities. But one of my neighbors had explained to us that the sudden infiltration of these mushrooms was due to spores in the ash from the surrounding fire activity that had traveled to the area and rested in the soil. Again, I'm not sure how scientifically accurate that is, but the scientific truth of that isn't really what I'm interested in. It's more so the stories and experiences of the community and how they both view and are impacted by extreme weather, including wildfires and the resulting environmental change. So that describes the inspiration for and origins of this project as they occurred over the course of the summer months in 2021. My plan following that summer was to track the fire activity in the area between the months of May and August, focusing on active fires as well as the various changes that they caused to the surrounding landscape and environment. And I now want to talk a bit about how much of this plan was completely derailed and how things have now shifted. And I think it's important to highlight and talk about the challenges of a project and the way things can pivot and go in a very unexpected direction. I know there are undergrads in the crowd today, and I just want to throw it out there that things often don't go according to plan. And in my experience, at least, those unexpected challenges usually lead to better and more interesting outcomes. So just a side note to embrace the obstacles as much as you can. So getting back to it, I had planned to do most of my field work last summer, expecting there to be regular wildfires in the area that I would be able to track and photograph. And as it turned out, that was not at all the case. There were a ton of devastating fires taking place elsewhere in Canada and around the world, but there was very little happening in the actual area that I'm working in. And so this not only derailed my plans, but also caused a great deal of introspection. I found myself almost waiting, or dare I say, hoping for fires to start happening. Hope is absolutely the wrong word, of course. I would never actually hope for that. But it was a very weird thing to be going into the summer with an idea of the content I would be able to capture, and then being met with the reality that there weren't really any fires in the immediate area. So that really took me down a path of thinking about the ethical implications of waiting for or depending on environmental destruction for the sake of a research project. And that's still something I'm grappling with, to be honest. There is a bit of a sense of guilt there, as well as the realization that I was perhaps unintentionally romanticizing the devastating impacts of these wildfires, which is, of course, extremely problematic. So upon realizing that and sharing some of these challenges with the rest of the folks working on MDSSA projects, I made quite a big shift in terms of what I was really trying to do with the Life of Fire project. So in going through that process of deconstructing what I thought the project was going to be, which was more or less a photo essay of a single fire season, I came to a place of realizing that what I'm actually most interested in and what I'm actually getting at here is the story of this place in relation to how it's been impacted by fire activity. And that means a few different things for me and for this project. To start, it includes thinking through and documenting my own stories. One example would be the fire I talked about at the beginning of this presentation, but it also extends to fires that have destroyed prominent buildings, fires that have caused damage and loss to the property of neighbors and friends, and how wildfires in general have changed the way I and others are able to exist within this particular landscape. And in thinking through my personal experiences, I also can't ignore the stories of my family and those close to me. Both of my parents, like I said, have their own stories connected to experiences of fire in this particular area. This is both in terms of wildfires and how they've destroyed prominent buildings and spaces, but also as stories that are more so related to the connectedness which comes from intentional and recreational fire use. So in deconstructing what I thought the project would be, I've pivoted to something that is less voyeuristic and more so heavily grounded in both individual and collective storytelling. I still have a lot of work to do in terms of grounding this work theoretically, but after bringing up storytelling as a methodology, I want to draw upon the work of Eli Clare in their book, Exile and Pride. Claire identifies as genderqueer and disabled, and this book is largely about their connection to the rural logging town in Oregon, where they grew up. And it's also about the exile that they feel from that place after leaving it to live in a more urban setting. So while our positionalities and the ways that each of us move through the world are quite different, I also feel a deep sense of connection and relatability to how they view their relationship with the place that they grew up. A passage from Exile and Pride that I particularly connect with in relation to this project is Claire's discussion of the feelings encountered when returning to a place that is so prominent in your past, so unchanged in so many ways, yet also extremely vulnerable to the impact of environmental crisis and human enacted change. Claire writes, "In writing about the backwoods and the rural, white, working class culture found there, I'm not being nostalgic, reaching backward toward a recreation of the past. Rather, I am reaching toward my bones. When I write about losing that place, about living in exile, I'm putting words to a loss which also grasps at my bones." Now, I wouldn't say that I feel exiled like Claire does, but in thinking through my connection to this place, there are emerging realizations as to the colonial impact of my being there. So while I do feel like I belong there and that part of me is deeply rooted in that landscape, there are also these tensions that arise from the ways in which my living there and benefiting from that land is reinforcing a type of colonial violence that leads to increased environmental degradation related to fire activity and other factors. So drawing from Claire once again, this means that white people who want to save old growth forests, preserve watersheds, maintain biodiversity, have a different relationship to the struggle than do people of color, different from Native peoples whose genocide has been and still is intimately connected to environmental destruction. This passage is not only important to consider when interrogating my personal connections to the area as a white, middle-class, heteronormative settler scholar, but it's also relevant to the history and development of the Whiteshell as a cottage country getaway. As I mentioned earlier, the Whiteshell and the towns within it are born from and continue to exist within the parameters of colonial infrastructures and ideologies. And because of this history, many of the longtime residents, my family included, are primarily white and arguably quite privileged. And so acknowledging the connection I feel with this area and the stories that stem from it must coincide with the acknowledgement that my presence there is evidence of Indigenous displacement. So to bring this together a bit, I'm working within this sort of multi-scope and interconnected ethnographic exploration that looks at the effects of wildfire activity from one, a very narrow personal view, two, from a generational or familial perspective, and then finally from a broader standpoint, which is the land itself and the communities situated there as they have been impacted by fire activity. And I think these are all intertwined in various ways, but also quite distinct in how they manifest and how they relate to each individual who occupies the area. So when thinking about the broader perspective of how the land and community is impacted, I'm approaching this part of the research from a few different angles. Where before I was waiting for active fires so that I could take pictures of the immediate damage, I'm now also planning to photograph areas that have previously been impacted by wildfires in some way. I'm also going through archives and collecting news stories and photos of significant fire sites. In this slide, I have shared two images of the site where the Falcon Lake Motel used to stand. The motel was parallel to Highway number 1 and located just past the entrance to Falcon Lake on Highway 301. The motel was built in 1959 and later destroyed in a fire in 1981. Nothing was ever built in its place to my knowledge, and for as long as I can remember, there has just been this empty cement pad where the building and the parking lot used to stand. And then there was a circular driveway as well that would have allowed cars to pull up in front of the entrance. Currently, this area is being used as a staging area for construction equipment as the province works on expanding the width of the Highway number 1 between Falcon Lake and the Ontario border. So the image on the right, which isn't the best view of the area, shows the portion of the 301 that passes by the empty lot. At the bend in the road, you can see a bit of the clearing that's been left there. On the left is an image from a master's thesis in landscape architecture from 1982, which is titled Towards an Appreciation of the Environment. This image is a mock-up of an aerial view of the site. I know it's hard to make all the details out, but this is a plan for a visitor center and a set of rental cabins that could have potentially filled that space. These plans were never implemented, and like I said earlier, the space remains empty and is currently being used as a highway construction staging area. So I plan to do some further research into why this site was never redeveloped, but for now I'm going to assume that cost was likely a large factor in that decision. Moving on, I also wanted to touch on the more recent losses of two other prominent buildings in and near the community. On the left is an image of the West Hawk Inn burning in August of 2014. This building had been standing since around 1930 and has changed hands several times throughout the years. At one time, it was known as Katie's Tea Room. Then in the 40s, it became the Trans-Canada Restaurant, and finally became the West Hawk Inn in the late 1970s. During its time as the West Hawk Inn, it was expanded to include motel-style rental cabins behind the restaurant. A patio was added, and the indoor bar and dance floor area were renovated in the 1990s, which made it a very popular spot for locals and visitors looking for some cottage country nightlife. And most recently, the restaurant side was occupied by a Chinese restaurant. And then on the right, we have an image of the Manaki Lodge engulfed in flames. This photo was taken during the fire in 2003, when much of the nearly 90-year-old property was burnt to the ground. Now, Manaki is not directly part of the community I'm working within. It's actually just past the Ontario border, but this resort was such a pillar of nearby communities for so long, and losing it was a pretty significant blow to many people in the Falcon and West Hawk area. So I would be remiss to leave it out of this discussion entirely. There were plans to redevelop this site into condominiums in 2016, which did not move forward. And in 2020 to 2021, a few different development plans were circulating. One option being to reopen as a resort with a large restaurant, spaces for RVs, and the renovation of several heritage cabins that still exist on the property. Other options included selling off pieces of the property as individual cottage lots and using the space as a campground. And this is the most recent information I've been able to find, and to date, I haven't been able to track down what, if anything, is currently planned for the property. But for both of these spaces, currently nothing has been built to replace them. So now that I've outlined the various perspectives I'm considering and some of the more notable fires in the area over the decades, I want to really highlight the ways that stories and storytelling are shaping this project. When we think of storytelling in terms of the environment and the way that it is impacted by factors such as fire, how we understand and respond to these types of environmental and community-centered degradations goes beyond the facts presented by the natural sciences. Being new to working in the environmental humanities, it's been a bit of a challenge for me to determine what exactly this project is and what it intends to do. And I think what it all comes back to is really trying to tell the story of a place that is both preserved in time by much of its cottage country infrastructures, yet also forced to slowly change due to factors related to climate change, increased visitor traffic, greater economic divides, and the pressure of upkeep and perceived relevancy. So I want to highlight two ideas from historian Tom Griffiths. Both of these were taken from an article about water. So although they're not explicitly tied to my work on wildfires, I think they are still quite relevant to the project I'm undertaking. The first I want to highlight reads, historian Tom Griffiths describes storytelling as a highly refined science. It is the most powerful educational tool we possess. It is learning distilled in a common language. It is also a privileged carrier of truth, a way of allowing for multiplicity and complexity at the same time as guaranteeing memorability. And the second, through narrative, historians can incorporate multiple points of view and enact connectivity across peoples, times, disciplines, and places. Narrative enables connectivity in the present, sharing knowledge in an accessible form, which can change the ways we approach an uncertain future. In doing so, stories remind us of our agency, that our fate is not historically predetermined. It is through such stories that we can understand the cultural roots of the challenges that confront us today. So, in other words, the documenting and telling of stories related to environmental degradation is in itself a scientific practice. And I by no means want to discount the importance of the natural sciences or claim that stories and ethnographical work can transcend more scientific interrogations. For my purposes, I think I see stories and storytelling as a research methodology that can and should run parallel to more scientific inquiries. Stories are important. The way that we capture and share experience is important, and our individual and collective relationships to the lands we are connected to are important. So for these reasons, and in my opinion, stories should be viewed as a crucial and accessible part of both environmental humanities research and knowledge dissemination. And that, in essence, is what this project is moving towards. A collection of stories told through photographs, both mine and those taken by others, life writing, individual and collective memory, and the evidence of an impacted landscape. I'm getting close to the end here, but before closing this off, I want to briefly talk about some of the tensions I've come across so far that have not only shaped what Life of Fire has become at this point, but that have also given me a lot to think about as I move forward. And for me, identifying and grappling with these dichotomies is one of the most interesting parts of this work, while also being one of the most challenging. So I'm thinking through the tensions between fire being destructive while also being regenerative. And by this, I mean how fire is able to nourish the earth through the process of burning the brush on the forest floor. I'm also thinking of the intentional burning of farmers' fields here, which isn't super relevant to this project, but is part of the larger picture. I'm thinking about fire as disabling versus the potential it has to be life-sustaining. By this, I mean how fire and smoke can be disabling to animals, humans, and the land itself, versus its ability to provide the warmth required for us to eat and survive. I'm thinking about fire as displacing versus fire as a means of connection. So not only thinking about how wildfires cause people and animals to lose their homes, but also considering the ways that fires are used recreationally and as a place for gathering. And finally, I'm thinking about larger questions that are not only related to the impacts of fire or that can contribute to more widespread fire activity, but that speak to how the area is impacted by human intervention in various ways. I'm just beginning to dig into these topics, and truthfully, they may end up being outside the scope of Life of Fire as a micro project under the MDSSA umbrella. But I think it's important to point out the tensions between promoting recreational access to a place while also trying to prioritize environmental conservation. Which leads me into a bit of an existential battle of reconciling access versus excess. By access, I'm thinking less in terms of disability politics and more so in relation to access as a broader construct. I absolutely think these rural cottage communities should be made as accessible as possible for folks with disabilities. The qualm I have is directed towards how excessive wealth and unlimited resources create increased opportunities for environmental injuries. This might lead to increased rates of construction, the marketing of various touristic opportunities, or creating infrastructures that make visiting undeveloped backcountry areas much easier than it used to be. And all of these have serious implications for both the land and the community. So in giving this presentation, I wanted to hopefully provide a sense of how this project began, the way that it's progressed and shifted throughout my process so far, and where I currently stand with it. So as I move forward with this research, I'm going to continue photographing active fires as well as previously affected areas. I'm going to be writing stories about my own fire-related experiences over the course of my time spent in Falcon Lake. I have several boxes of photographs from my parents' storage unit that I need to go through. I'm hoping to incorporate other community members' stories in some way. And I'm continuing to look through the Manitoba archives, news articles, and other sources of community-based knowledge, such as the Whiteshell Natural History Museum in Nudimick Lake. So if it seems like there's a lot of moving parts here, that's because there is. I'm not entirely sure what the final output will be. The MDSSA group as a whole is considering ways that we can bring our projects together and disseminate our work collectively. As it stands for me right now, I envision it becoming an exhibition or a publication of some sort that marries the various elements I've pointed to. So something that perhaps collages what I've created with the stories and photos of others, and that's tied together with a writing element. Again, that is up in the air at this point, so stay tuned for updates. And that brings me to the end of what I have prepared for today. Thank you so much for being here again and for listening to me talk about this work in progress. I'm super excited about this project and am happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Okay, thank you so much, Amy. That was like fascinating. Thank you. I really appreciate your insight, and this is a great project. The questions are coming in the question and answer box here. So maybe I'll start with a more factual one that just came in. Were the fires at the resort caused by wildfires, or were they contained to those buildings?
The two that I had pointed to, the Manaki Resort and the West Hawk Inn, I believe were just contained to those buildings. Certainly the West Hawk Inn was. It had started really early in the morning. I think it may have been a kitchen fire, but it was quickly contained within the community or within that set building. For Manaki, I'm not entirely sure. I know a big part of the property was lost. But I'm not entirely sure how much of it actually spread to the nearby like forest and woods around it.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, one that's a little bit more abstract and more methodologically informed. So how do you think the focus of research on observing, collecting, and data impacts what is being researched? Another way to to phrase it would be, how much does our methodologies and mindset change us, our actions, the effects on what we're researching? So this link between methodologies and what we're actually researching, and now how do they impact each other? How does the methodology affect your object and your actions in regard to those objects of studies and whatnot?
That's a really good question and a really big question, I think. I think like in terms of methodology and kind of thinking through like using photographs and storytelling as a way to interrogate these environmental crises that are happening. For me, and just based on some of the reading I've done, some of the readings I pointed to today, there is this greater sense of connection, I think, between the people that are impacted in the area, but also people that may view the project or read whatever we're producing, versus something that may be more like factually, scientifically based. Like if people can make that connection to something that they can see and experience in front of them, I think that has a big impact on the reach of the project as well as the audiences that it might impact. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but.
Thank you very much. Another question from an anonymous attendee. Whose stories are allowed to be told and to whom and in what realms about climate destruction presently? How does this affect the trajectory of our understanding and possible future possibilities?
Again, another big question. I think, I mean, thinking about this from like a broader perspective, it's obvious that the people whose stories I've told have been largely influenced by colonial structures and colonial violence. Looking at my project specifically, I would love to speak with people in the community and have their stories being told. That would be a matter of me getting the ethical approval from a university to do that. But it's definitely something that I want to explore. I would also love to try and involve more Indigenous community members in this project in some way. Like I mentioned, there are, or the community is kind of right on the border of Shoal Lake 40 First Nation. So there is that kind of close connection between the communities, but also this very distinct separation between a First Nation community and then this predominantly like white cottage country. So I'm trying to be very intentional in who and what stories come out in this project and being very aware of the marginalized voices that should be heard and that should be spoken within it. Right now, to the point I've come so far, it's been very much just my perspective and stories I've heard from my family. But moving forward and kind of getting deeper into all these issues that have kind of emerged through the process of researching it, I would love to kind of bring in some of those more marginalized voices and ensure that there's a variety of stories being told about not only the landscape, but the people that are impacted by it.
Right. Thank you very much. Well, this question overlaps a little bit with the previous one. Annalise is asking if Indigenous stories from the area will be incorporated into the project in any way. So I think you've answered that. But how have fires impacted the Indigenous communities of the area, and has the impact on them been more severe than the impact on white cottagers?
That is a question that I would speculatively say they probably have been more impacted. I can't speak to that just yet, just because I haven't spoken with those people and I don't want to speak on their behalf in any way. So that would be something that I would explore moving forward and kind of looking at the differences in the ways that these white cottagers versus Indigenous community members are affected. But at this point, it's not really something I can speak to, nor do I want to make any implications that may not be correct.
Okay, thank you very much. That's fair. Now is a question from Canada, Rifkent. So great talk, Amy, and such an interesting topic. Canada is wondering about the environmental impacts of fire management and control. For instance, the toxicity of chemicals used to douse fires and the potential contamination of water wells, as well as water and other habitats for animal life, etc. So in other words, when does the impact of fire end and on humans, when does the impact of fire end on humans and non-humans?
That's a great question. Thank you, Canada. That is not something I've thought of too thoroughly just yet, but I think that plays into a lot of these kind of like dichotomies I'm looking at, where it's like trying to contain these fires and kind of save the community that's been built there versus what the effect of doing so will have on the plant and animal life on it. So I think there's this kind of balance that I'm not sure can be struck, but it's something that I'm certainly going to have to consider and kind of look into a little bit more. I don't really have like a really eloquent answer on that one for this point, but it is a great question and for sure something I'll have to think about.
Thank you so much. I have another question here from Dominique Chad, who's like a student in the class as well as Annalise earlier. Thank you for sharing your research and process with us. I'm not sure if this is in the scope of your project, but have you looked or do you plan to look at stories of combating these fires from the perspective of emergency service personnel or the perspective of community members involved in those practices? You know, like basically the perspective of emergency personnel fighting those fires.
Yeah, great question. I have thought about it. I haven't gotten to it just yet. In like the immediate area I'm working at, it is all like volunteer firefighter based. And then I'm not sure exactly who runs like the water bomber airplanes that I mentioned, but the actual people, like the first responders to like a brush fire, it's all volunteer based. So from my knowledge in those instances, the act of getting to the fire to try and contain it is very it's a very long process, or it's a longer process than it would be, say, in like a city, because these volunteer firefighters are contacted wherever they are at the time, have to go to the fire station and then go to the fire. So it's a very kind of, I don't want to say like unregulated, but it's a very community enacted thing. And I think it will be important to talk to those people that are the volunteer firefighters and looking at the other people that are working within different means of fire containment. I haven't just yet, but it is definitely like on the radar to hopefully talk to those people and get their perspectives and their experiences as well.
Right. Thank you so much. Here I have another question here, and that I'm sure you might have a lot to say about that because it plays into your like broader research project for your doctoral dissertation about comics and mental health. So the question, simple as that, is how does mental health play into your research?
Great question.
In relation to this project, or maybe more broadly speaking, perhaps.
Yeah. I mean, for me, it's something that plays into, I think, like all of the work I do, just because my doctoral research is very much grounded in mental health and looking at how mental health is represented and how mental illness experiences are viewed by the mainstream, how communities are coming together around various types of media to kind of offer these different means of support. And then looking at this project, it's kind of thinking through like my own experiences with mental health in a very different context. So thinking like one of the reasons this project is so important to me is because the place is so important to me. And going there and being able to get out of the city and be in this kind of rural setting is very important for my mental health personally. But I think a lot of people do also commiserate with that. So when you have these kind of outdoor recreational spaces that are now being infiltrated with different environmental catastrophes, I definitely think there is like a mental health aspect there that is impacted. So for me, it's kind of, I can't think about the ways that the environment is being impacted without also considering my own mental health, but also the mental health of the community and how that is impacting them both physically in terms of the community they live within, but also in the ways that they are kind of moving through life and the ways that they're feeling and thinking through all these things that are happening.
All right, thank you so much. And perhaps I have a question as well. As part of your project, do you see a difference, or does that difference even matter between naturally occurring fires and human-caused fires, or perhaps, you know, given the context of climate change and climate emergency, there's no such difference, and that we could possibly argue that all naturally occurring fire are connected to human changes to the environment. But I'm just thinking of the different dichotomies you're bringing in. So could that be another one of those dichotomies, you know, this relationship with naturally versus human-caused fire?
Yeah, I think it's definitely plays into that like dichotomies conversation and thinking, because I mean, the more human presence there is in the area, the more fires are tended to be. So especially with COVID, when so many people were coming to the area because there was, you know, nothing else to do, let's say, more people that aren't maybe familiar with kind of like the practices of being in like backcountry areas, or that are littering a lot more. Like fires are being started from like RVs that aren't supposed to be in these kind of like forest paths, and the smoke and sparks from the exhaust is causing fires. So I think there is a difference. It's something that I'm still kind of thinking through, but I think that plays into this kind of like larger idea that I was talking about of like access versus excess. And like the more increased access we have to this space, and I don't mean this from like a disabilities perspective, just like across the board, the more people that can access it easily and come to this area and bring in various things that can start fires, all that excess being in the area is going to then in turn lead to it being less accessible in a way. So it's kind of like this, I think, interesting cycle of trying to create more access and then it becoming too much for the environment to handle, and then leading to like the degradation of that space. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
No, it absolutely does. Thank you. That was great. I have a question that's somewhat related to that here from Charles Benson, who asked, "Thank you so much for sharing this work in progress. I look forward to following it as it unfolds. I like how you touched on people with wealth have the ability to create their access to the land/water, and how this privilege impacts the environment." So the question is, can you expand a little further on ways this can be regulated for moving forwards?
That is a really great question. Thank you. And it's a difficult one to answer, but I'll answer it from my like personal perspective. So my family, my parents purchased their property in Falcon Lake in the 80s for like around $30,000. Today, a property, like an equivalent property, is going for close to $2 million, which is just like, it's madness, right? So there's a lot of people that are now coming to the area and kind of where, you know, older families that can no longer afford to be there are selling their properties, or, you know, the children don't want to take over the property, whatever the case may be, are coming in with a lot of money and kind of building these like mansions on the lake, for lack of a better word, and kind of taking up a lot of that space and bringing in a lot of resources and money that wasn't necessarily there before. So as far as it being regulated, I don't know all the ins and outs of that. I do know that the lake itself, like no additional properties can be built around the lake. Like they've kind of like capped that. Everything that is crown land has to remain crown land. But that doesn't mean that someone will come in and tear down like a 500 square foot cottage and put up something that's like 3,000 square feet, and then have these like large boats that are now on the lake. And there's, for instance, people that are helicoptering in and out on the weekends as opposed to driving there. So there are a lot of different factors that are affecting the environment due to this increase in like the collective wealth, I think, that is at that in this space. And I mean, I don't want to like talk down about anyone or people that have money in any way, but it certainly is impacting the environment and the way that people that have been there for generations are able to exist within that space in a lot of ways as well. So in terms of regulating it, it's not really a question I know the answer to. Speculatively, I mean, I almost don't want to say it, but speculatively, when you have enough money to kind of control the circumstances in your favor, I think that also comes into play a little bit as well. But yeah, I'm sorry, that was a long drawn out kind of ramble that I could keep going on about. But as far as regulation, I'm not sure, but it's definitely something that I'll have to look into and kind of bring in that perspective as well, and seeing if those regulations are followed or what people can do to kind of ensure that they're being followed.
Right, thank you. I have also here a question about gentrification and in its relation to the fires. I think you've already approached some of that in your previous couple of answers, but I'd like to acknowledge the question nevertheless. And then a question about how much the fire is natural and how much is caused directly or indirectly by continuing colonial settlement. So I think that speaks a little bit to the question that I'd ask you between human caused versus naturally occurring fires, but I don't know if you want to expand on that a little bit in relation to colonial settlement in particular.
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of goes without saying a little bit, like these kind of like Whiteshell resort towns are very colonial. Like they're very predominantly white. They were kind of created for these like weekend getaways for people from Winnipeg that could afford to go there. So it is a very colonial presence there. And I think just having that colonial presence that then becomes greater and greater with the more wealth that comes in and with more people flocking to the area is certainly going to result in more fire activity happening due to those reasons. So I think there certainly is a connection there. I don't know how much more I have to say about that I haven't already touched on, but I haven't done like a kind of data breakdown of what like how natural occurring fire versus like human negligence. But it's something I should probably consider going forward just to have that kind of like concrete data. But I definitely think that there is a very clear correlation between like the more like human presence, and especially from people that aren't kind of like from the area or aren't as maybe like fire smart, for lack of a better words, that are unintentionally starting these fires, of course, but it is adding to those instances in the area for sure.
Thank you. And actually, I think I misread the question about gentrification, so I'd like to bring it back. The person's asking how do these natural disasters or do they cause gentrification of natural areas? So I guess what is meant is that are the areas that have been devastated then by natural disaster are then open for further development, or is this, as you said, like kind of lockdown that you can't build new properties anymore? And
I think where the issue comes in is that like if there is a property that's destroyed by a large fire and then the people that own that property that have maybe owned it for 50 years, let's say, now can't afford to rebuild for whatever reason, and nothing can then happen with that. Like, I think that is a way that people are then forced out. And then that kind of brings in new people with a lot of money that can afford to kind of put up these big resorts or whatever the case may be. So I think kind of inadvertently, it definitely leads to more and more gentrification, maybe not intentionally, but the way that kind of the economy is in the area certainly has an impact on that, I'd say.
Okay, now that's a great question. I apologize if I misread it earlier. That was a great question, and that's very interesting. Thank you. I think these were the last question that we've had, and I think we had reserved an hour, right, for you to talk anyway. So we're just about the end of our time here. So I'd like to thank everyone for all of their very generative questions here in the chat. I'd love to thank you once again, Amy, for so generously giving your time and sharing this research with us. And thank you to Jen for doing the interpretation, much appreciated. And of course to Jennifer Gibson, who organized this, and Evan for his technical expertise helping us out with this morning's event. So that will conclude our event today. Thank you so much. Amy, do you have any last words that you'd like to share?
Just thank you so much for having me, Jennifer and Bruno, and thank you, Jen, for interpreting, and Evan for being on the back end of things. And just to everyone for being here and listening. And I mean, as I said, it's a work in progress, but it's really exciting to share this work and to keep working on it. And all the questions give me a lot of great feedback too, to kind of consider moving forward. So thank you so much for that.
All right. Thank you so much, Amy. Nice to see you again.
See you too.
Okay. Bye-bye.